first one is the bloody code ended and transportation ended, and they were two of the main forms of punishment at the point which prisons changed. And if they were no longer going to be the main form of punishment, i.e. executions for so many crimes, and if people weren't going to be able to be sent away, they have to be punished in some way, or they had to be punished in some way, and that way, kind of by default, end up being prisons. And so if prisons were going to be the main form of punishment, they had to be up to standard. And as you're about to see in the second paragraph, they weren't. So that would be one reason, but not necessarily the main reason. Actually, my main reason would be this: there were problems with the old system and then problems with the separate system. If it wasn't a problem, if there was no problems with those systems, then it wouldn't have changed, regardless of whether prisons had become the main form or not. So the problems with the old system, well, corruption. So you could actually pay to get a lovely cell, and you could even, in some prisons, pay for somebody else to serve the sentence. There was terrible overcrowding, massive poverty. The prisoners had to pay the prison wardens. So, and if they didn't have the money to, they had to rely on charity. And it was seen that the old prisons were like schools of crime. So with the advent of the Gauls Act and the building of new prisons, things changed to the separate system. But there was something terribly wrong with the separate system. Well, two things really. One, keeping every prisoner separate was astronomically expensive, and the country could afford a prison system for the first time, but couldn't afford that. And secondly, it actually sent some prisoners insane, gave them breakdowns, because it was just not mentally healthy to keep them isolated and on their own for long periods. So that had to change. So for both of those reasons, the prison system had to change. If there was no problems with the prison system, it would have stayed the same, regardless of the other factors. And finally, of course, there was the role of the reformers. Howard, who was one of the first, he was the sheriff in Bedfordshire, I believe, but he was the sheriff. He went to inspect prisons and he was horrified by what he found, so he wrote a report. And he was important because he spread awareness. Elizabeth Fry was the same sort of thing. She went to see Newgate Gaol, found horrific conditions, said things needed to change, especially among the Quaker community. She spread awareness and tried to get more of them involved. And both of those, it was like spreading the awareness of how horrible the situation was in the 1700s and the early 1800s. Peel, though, he had the power to actually change things as a reformer. He was influenced by Fry and Howard, who raised that awareness, but he was the one who introduced the Gauls Act of 1823, which led on from that to the separate system being developed and the new prisons like Pentonville. So all three of those were important because changes wouldn't have happened, but the problems with the system were the main reason, because without them the reformers wouldn't have anything to raise awareness of. You see? So there we go. Now, of course, local communities did affect law and order, especially in the medieval period, because they had a lot to do with it. But what I would say is they didn't really affect law and order so much as being the ones at the bottom of the chain having to carry it out. So they did the hue and cry in the absence of anything else, and they were expected to do it. It was against the law not to do it, to down tools and run after a criminal. They gathered in tithings in the absence of any other law and order, and they all had to swear the law, the compurgation law, or the oath, should I say, the compurgation oath, to say that somebody's character was good if it was unsure whether or not they were guilty or not. All of these things had to be carried out by local communities, so they were important in carrying out law and order, but not really in affecting it. They didn't really change things. What did change things was religion. They had a big influence, especially because they got the church courts after the Norman conquest. And so that gave them a lot of power because they could try certain crimes that were to do with religion, like blasphemy or adultery in marriage. Also, people could, if they could manage to reach sanctuary, they could escape justice under the normal laws, which we'd call secular laws, and get justice in the church courts, which never executed anybody. They didn't do the capital punishment. So criminals could escape justice by reaching sanctuary, some people would say it was escape justice that was due to them. And they could escape justice really because they didn't have to face trial. After a certain period of time, they could choose to leave the country. Of course, until 1215, there was trial by ordeal. And so the church there was sort of deciding who was guilty or not, based on some crazy trials. And then people could eventually say the neck verse to prove, supposedly, that they were part of the clergy and should be tried in the church courts. So yeah, the church had a big influence on law and order. It's quite close between religion and government. You could argue either. I would say the government would have had the biggest influence on law and order in that period, because the church courts were perhaps the biggest reason why religion had any influence. And ultimately it was William I who granted the church laws when he conquered England. So he gave religion that power, which proves that the government, i.e. the king, because government is whoever is in control of the country, had ultimately the most power. The government were the ones who set the law. For example, Richard II introduced the first heresy law, which is a crime against God, but it was a king who was introducing it. And kings often appointed the bishops and the archbishops, who then of course had a say over the church courts and controlled the church courts. So ultimately the power in the medieval period was with the king, which was the government. So I would say it was the government who had the biggest impact on law and order. Of course you could talk about murder and fine and forest laws and plenty of other laws that were introduced by the government. Yes, it was to deter. That would be my biggest argument. Until the Industrial Revolution, pretty much so, from 1100 till the mid-1800s, the main aim of punishment was definitely to deter. They didn't have the money to try to reform people. So what did deter? Public executions, of course, especially when you think that they introduced a particularly horrible execution, being hung, drawn and quartered, especially for treason, to sort of say, well, this is how bad that crime is, and this is what will happen to you. And they did that in public for a reason. And I'll be giving the example of the gunpowder plotters, because the idea of deterring was not to deter the criminals who'd committed the crime, it was to deter potential criminals. People seeing what happened to the gunpowder plotters would look and go, I don't want that to happen to me. Same with mutilation, that was a key punishment. And sticking people in the stocks was humiliating. Other people go, glad that's not me. And of course, what I would be writing in this answer is, and it's legitimate to do this, it's a clever thing to do, I would be saying, of course, it could be argued that all punishments are at least in part there to deter criminals. You have a punishment so that there are consequences for actions that we don't want in society. So for all of those reasons above, yes, deterrent was the main reason why punishments were as they were in this period. Another potential reason for punishments is to remove the criminal from society so they no longer can have the effect they were having on society, away from the law-abiding people. And this could perhaps explain why executions were so prevalent in the time, from 1000 all the way up to 1700, but especially right at the end with the Bloody Code, when 50 crimes became punishable by death, removing the criminal. Of course, executions were used all the time before this, and it was like a very cheap punishment and a very quick punishment, and that's what punishments had to be in this period, because we couldn't afford anything else as a society. We weren't prepared to either pay for different types of punishments. And of course, transportation began in the 1660s. You might be looking at these dates, Bloody Code and transportation, and thinking, well, this is all at the end. Write it in your answer. Removing the criminal was not necessarily the main motivation behind punishments for most of the period 1000 to 1700, but it certainly was by the end, as proven by the evidence given here. And the final potential reason would be to reform, to change the criminals so that they don't act like they did in the future. I wouldn't say this is really the main logic in this period in question, because to reform can be quite expensive. That's what prisons try to do now, or arguably what they try to do now. And though there are some examples that could support this, like the houses of correction, where vagabonds were often sent to work really hard to try to teach them the value of hard work. Well, I'd be writing in my answer, houses of correction, making them work ridiculously hard is also a form of deterrent, because vagabonds wouldn't want to have to do that. And also you could talk about the ducking stool, where women who swore or spoke back and argued with the husbands could be dunked under the water as a punishment, which people would go and watch, so it's humiliating. Again, it's kind of a deterrent, but it would change their behaviour, or that was the idea. And also there's the Scald's Bridle, which I've got a picture of for you there, where if a woman again talked back, did something they shouldn't do, got ideas above their station, as they thought at the time, would be sort of dragged around a village on a lead with this in their mouth, something which would hold their tongue back and basically make them dribble. So it would be ridiculously humiliating, not at all pleasant, and the idea would stop them from doing what they were doing before. But again, I'll be pointing this back to, even this is a deterrent because it's humiliating, and other women would see it and go, won't fancy doing that. So yeah, that's why deterrent would be my main reason. I'm only doing 2 paragraphs here because I'm not sticking rigidly to a structure. I think I could do a better answer with just two very good paragraphs for this question, and a third I would just be scrabbling about with. And you've got to do that in your exam. If you sit there and look at the question and think, I can only do for or against here, or agree or disagree, or I can only think of 2 factors, only do 2 factors. Don't make yourself look stupid by trying to think of a third when you can't. So my first reason why there were new crimes was because of new technology. The internet exists now, and so you can get cybercrime, you can get horrible things like paedophiles in internet chat rooms. All of these crimes come about because of the internet. And you could have got cars now as well, so car crime is a thing that wasn't there before. Stealing cars, speeding, drink driving, all of those things, insurance fraud, car insurance fraud that is. There's cash points, so people get held up at knife point at cash points. Well, they didn't exist before. And of course terrorism. Terrorists are making use of new technology, driving vans into crowds, blowing up planes, flying planes into buildings, all sorts of things that horrible things that terrorists are doing that they couldn't necessarily have done before because of the new technology. There's so many different examples of technology and crime related to it. And my second paragraph would be about attitudes and values in society. They've changed, and so therefore the law has changed, and things that had always happened, in many cases, had become a crime because of attitudes changing. Whereas if people did them before, they weren't a crime. And a big example is the hate crimes. Hate crime became a crime in 2007 with the change of the law. It was no longer acceptable to be able to use racist language at people. Misuse of drugs, of course, so in the 60s and the 70s attitudes changed so that it was no longer acceptable for people to be taking drugs. And so it became against the law. And of course with the wars, the First and Second World Wars, the attitude changed in society so that people they were expected to join the army and do their bit, or they'd be conscientious object, or they'd be seen as shirking their duty and should be punished as conscientious objectors. And that happened in both world wars. So yeah, technology, attitudes in society. And you could pick either. It's up to you, your opinion as to what the main reason would be, but you just have to pick a main reason, whichever one, it's up to you. If you were arguing yes, it was because of religion, you could talk about the English Reformation. That's where Henry split the church, so it was Protestant and Catholic, And we know about all the problems that caused afterwards, where when you had one monarch it was alright to be Catholic and not to be Protestant, and another monarch you had to be Protestant, not Catholic, or you could risk imprisonment, no, not imprisonment, punishment should I say, often execution, like with Mary the First and the Protestants. And this all led to a lot of fear and superstition around this time. People were terrified about ending up going to hell for not doing the right thing, and this increased superstition meant people were more liable, more willing to believe in things like witchcraft. So yes, religion did play a role in increasing people's fears of the supernatural, especially because of the English Reformation and everything that happened afterwards with the monarchs. But I would say a bigger reason was the kings and queens, so the monarchs and government. For example, it was, of course, King Henry VIII who chose to do the Reformation in England in the first place. And in 1542, not long afterwards, witchcraft became an act punishable by death. So that's going to increase fear, because it looks like the king is scared of witchcraft, and therefore it's a thing everybody should be worried about. And of course, James I wrote his book Demonology, in which he wrote that some witches tried to have him and his family drowned at sea. And if the king's writing it, people believe it, and he influences other people. And finally, of course, it was the king, Charles I, and government who chose to go to war with each other. And the Civil War was such a catastrophic event, it increased fear and suspicion, and again made people willing to look to witches as a reason why bad things were happening. It's no coincidence that the Witchfinder General was operating during the Civil War, and that was the government fighting the king. So I would say the monarchs, not necessarily the kings, but the monarch, because of Mary, Elizabeth, but the monarchs and the government were the main reason why there was an increase in the accusations of witchcraft. And then, of course, we've got the old favourite, Mr. Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, who was said to have witnessed about 100 executions of witches, but he was only operating in East Anglia, which is a fairly big part of the country, but it's only one part of the country. So he wasn't something that was causing accusations of witchcraft across the land. And what I would say about Matthew Hopkins is he wasn't really a cause of the increase in accusations of witchcraft. He was a symptom. So it's like if you get tonsillitis, your sore throat is not what's caused you to have tonsillitis, it's the symptom after you've caught it. So people were already willing to believe things that Matthew Hopkins was saying because of everything that was gone before with religion and with the kings and government. And I would be using that in my example. I would say Matthew Hopkins did increase fear of witches in a certain area in East Anglia where he operated, but he was more of a symptom than a cause of the increase of accusations of witchcraft. Another one with 2 paragraphs instead of 3, remember, that's fine. If you've only got 2 paragraphs to say, do 2 paragraphs. And this one, it's really difficult to do anything other than agree, disagree, conclusion, because of the nature of the question. Of course, first point, you should know what penal system means. It's punishments. Every question will be about punishments, crime, or law enforcement. So you can work out by what it's talking about that this one is about punishments, even if you didn't know about the word penal, which is a funny word, I understand. Now, my first paragraph, I would disagree, because by the end, the bloody code had died out in the 1820s, 30s, and the last public execution was 1868. So you can't argue that it was a massive part of the penal system for the entire 400 years in the question, because it's just not, clearly, because it didn't happen in those last 32 years. So those would be the things that I'd be pointing out as my key evidence why it wasn't a key feature. And if this is from 1500 onwards, well, bloody code itself only started from 1688 onwards. Execution was, before that point, the ultimate punishment, i.e. hung, drawn and quartered with the gunpowder plotters and other treason convicts. And it was a deterrent, but it wasn't the main form of punishment, because It just wasn't, otherwise the bloody code would have been happening earlier. There was other forms of punishment that people resorted to before execution, and so that suggests that maybe it wasn't the main or the key or so important as the question statement suggests. But there's always two sides to every argument, and you could agree, because the bloody code, 1688, and by 1815, 225 crimes were punishable by death. And hung, drawn and quartered was very important before that. It was invented as a massive deterrent. It was crucial. That's why we know about it happening. That's why it's a key feature of the Gunpowder Plot. Mary I was publicly burning Protestants who refused to recant their faith and say that they were Catholic. And there was only the last 32 years of these 400 years that didn't have public executions. So clearly it was an important feature of the penal system, and it was the ultimate punishment, it was the ultimate threat and the ultimate deterrent. So you could argue that it was very important. But which one you end up concluding is entirely up to you. You could argue either. It's another two-paragrapher, and so my first paragraph would be the main reason they changed law and order was to keep control of the country that they'd conquered. We know all about this from our other module. For example, a murder and fine had to be introduced because Normans kept appearing dead in mysterious circumstances, so they had to introduce a severe fine for everybody in the local area to stop this from happening, and also that people would hand over the perpetrators. They also introduced the forest laws to stop people hunting in the king's forest land, and he introduced the church courts, which would help him keep law and order and control of the country because he's delegating it so the church can look after certain areas. And another change which would help him keep control would be to change the language of the courts to Norman French, because, well, then they'd understand what was going on, even if the people being tried wouldn't necessarily. All of these would help them to keep control of the country. And what I would hope would be a really clever second paragraph would be to argue, well, there is an issue with the question. I'd even be writing this. Of course there is an issue with the question because it assumes the Normans did change law and order, but they didn't change it very much. So it's a bit of a misleading question. And I would give examples. That's fine. Questioning the question in this case, clever thing to do. I would only do it if you're sure. It's a bit risky. But, trial by ordeal happened before and afterwards. The majority of laws were purposefully kept by William because he wanted it to appear like he was the rightful king after Edward, so he wanted to keep Edward's laws. Mutilations, corporal punishment like that, and executions, they were all features of crime and punishment from before the Normans took over. So, and you can argue that, the Normans actually didn't change things very much, so the question is misleading. And I'd put that in my second paragraph. Remember, only do something like that if you're sure, or you could really stitch yourself up. My first paragraph would be, what alternative did they have? They didn't have DNA, they didn't even have detectives. They just had each other, usually the local communities, maybe the sheriff, probably the local constable, trying to find out whether they did it. And unless you actually caught a criminal in the act of committing the crime, you're probably not going to be able to prove that they were guilty or not using the methods or sorts of methods we'd use now. They just did not have the technology or the money or the means to be able to do it. So, in the lack of an available alternative, they turned to God, which links to the second paragraph. England at the time was massively religious, and it was a very superstitious society. We've talked about this in other questions, but with a very powerful church. So people thought, people didn't just think their entire being believed, they were taught as though it was fact that God was all powerful. And so it stood to reason in their brains. It was logical that if God was all powerful, he could send you messages. If he wanted you to think somebody was guilty, he would send a message. So they set up these trials to try to get God to send them a message. But they had no understanding of germs. So trial by ordeal, where they hurt somebody and see how the wounds healed, like trial by hot water, well, we know that germs would have affected whether the wounds were healing nicely or not God. But it all comes down to people being so religious that they believed that this was true, that God would send them a sign, and it was a reliable way of finding out whether somebody was guilty or not. And there we go again. I will just have 2 paragraphs with that one, because otherwise I'd be scrabbling around for a 3rd paragraph, which I don't think would sound particularly good. It's always fine to not stick to 3 paragraphs if you're not sure.